"And may I present," the Duke of Wescliffe said grandly to the visiting baron, gesturing across the candlelit table toward his own wife. He stopped. The name was simply not there. 100 guests, 100 forks paused over Sevres china, and Aubrey Wescliffe stood with his glass half raised and the word he wanted lost somewhere behind his teeth. "My Duchess," he finished, and laughed it off, and the baron laughed too, and the moment passed for everyone in the room but two. Eugenia, at the foot of the long table, did not stop smiling. That was the thing he would remember afterward, when there was nothing left to do but remember. She inclined her head to the baron as though nothing at all had happened, as though her husband had not just forgotten her given name in front of the assembled gentry of 3 counties, and she said something gracious about the man's journey through the rain, and the talk flowed on around her like water around a stone. Aubrey sat. He did not give it another thought that night. He was a busy man after all. There were the drainage schemes on the eastern farms, the matter of the borough seat, the endless correspondence that came with a name as old as his. A wife was a fixed point. One did not have to keep noticing a fixed point. It was simply there, at the foot of the table, smiling. He had married her 4 years before because the match was sensible and her people were good and her dowry tidy, and because, if he was honest, she had been the least troublesome of the season's offerings, quiet, well-read, undemanding. She had asked nothing of him. He had been grateful for that, in the careless way a man is grateful for a fire that does not smoke. He did not tend it. He sat near it and went on with his work. So he did not notice, that winter, that she had stopped coming down early to pour his coffee. He took it from the footman and never looked up. He did not notice that the music room, where she used to play in the long blue afternoons, had gone quiet. He did not notice that when he spoke to her now it was in instructions. See to the Pelham invitation, the chimney in the west wing smokes, we dine with the bishop, Thursday, and that she answered each one with the same, even courtesy and never any more, with anything of herself. There was an evening at the Hartfields when a young man, some cousin newly down from town, sat beside Eugenia and made her laugh. Aubrey heard it across the room, a real laugh, low and surprised and warm, a sound he could not at once place because it had been so long since he had been its cause. He looked over. His wife had her head tilted and her eyes bright, and a colour in her face he did not recognize, and for one strange moment the Duke of Wescliffe felt something cold move through him, some animal thing, before his reason smoothed it flat. She was his wife. The young man was nobody. He turned back to his conversation about the borough and forgot it. His own mother, before she died, had tried once to warn him. She had come upon him in his study late one night, buried to the elbows in surveys and ledgers, and she had stood in the doorway a long while before she said, quietly, that a wife was not a property to be entered in a book and let alone. He had answered, without looking up, that Eugenia wanted for nothing, that she had her allowance, her carriage, her place at the head of his table, every comfort a duchess could ask. And his mother had said, in a voice he remembered now with a cold clarity, that there was one comfort he had not named, and that it was the only one that mattered, and that he would learn its name too late if he were not careful. He had thought her sentimental. He had gone back to his surveys. He could not now recall whether he had even bidden her good night. The strange thing, looking back, was how easy it had been to overlook her, for there had been nothing in Eugenia to demand his notice. She did not weep or reproach him. She did not sulk or scheme. She made no scenes and laid no traps. She only grew, by slow degrees, quieter, and her quiet was so undemanding that he mistook it for contentment. A woman who shouted he would have heard, a woman who wept he could not have ignored, but Eugenia did neither. She simply withdrew, an inch at a time, into the small private country of herself, and closed the gates so gently that the Duke, going about his loud important business, never heard them shut. He would have done better to remember. The night it ended he did not know it was ending. They had a small dinner, only a dozen guests, the Pelhams, the rector, an aunt of his with a carrying voice. Eugenia wore grey silk and her grandmother's pearls, and she was, he supposed, looking at her across the candles, rather handsome still. He had a vague intention of telling her so, later, when the guests had gone. The aunt was holding forth on the new fashion in bonnets. The rector said something about the spring planting, and the aunt, turning her bright cruel eyes down the table, said, "Wescliffe, you must settle a wager for us. Your wife was a Staunton, was she not, before you had her? What was her Christian name? I will swear I have never once heard you use it." The table laughed lightly the way tables do. Aubrey opened his mouth, and it was not there. He knew it began with an E. He knew it was a soft name, an old name, that her mother had chosen it. He had said it at the altar 4 years before, repeated it after the bishop in a voice that did not shake, and now asked plainly for it across his own candlelit table. The Duke of Wescliffe could not produce his wife's name. The silence ran 1 second too. He saw the rector look at his plate. He saw the aunt's eyes glittering. And he saw Eugenia. She was not stricken. He had braced in that half instant for hurt, for the small flinch that would let him laugh and recover and call her Eugenia. It came to him now, too late. Eugenia, of course, Eugenia, but there was no flinch. She only looked at him down the length of the table, steady and clear, and she smiled. It was a perfectly serene smile, a smile with nothing behind it at all, the smile she gave to strangers, and it told him, more plainly than weeping ever could have, that she had stopped expecting better of him a long time ago, and had only just now stopped hoping. "It is Eugenia," she said quietly for him, supplying the word he had failed to find. "Will you forgive me? I find I have the headache. Pray do not let me break up the table." And she rose, and the gentleman rose, and she went out of the room with her head high and her grey silk whispering over the floor, and Aubrey watched the door close behind her and felt, for the first time in 4 years, the chair at the fire grow cold. She was gone in the morning. Not run off, nothing so vulgar as that. The Duke of Wescliffe's wife did not run. There was a note on the breakfast table, folded once in her even hand. She had gone to her aunt at Linden, in the north. She thought the note said that they would both do better apart for a while, that she had been for some time a piece of furniture in his house, and that furniture at least had the dignity of being chosen for, and she found she could no longer be a thing he did not have to see. She wished him well of his borough. She had taken nothing that was his. She had signed it Eugenia, the full clear name, as though to leave it with him. He read it 3 times. Then he rang for the carriage, and was halfway to the stables before he understood that he did not know where Linden was, and had to go back and find it on a map like a stranger looking for a town he had never had occasion to visit, because his wife's family seat was a place he had never once troubled to learn. The house was very quiet without her. He had thought it always quiet. He discovered now that he had been wrong, that she had filled it the way a held breath fills a room, that there had been a quality of waiting in the silence that was now simply silence. The coffee came up cold because no one poured it. The music room stood with its instruments shut. He found himself, in the evenings, glancing toward the foot of the table where the candles still burned over an empty place, and finding it empty, and not being able to bear it. He went into the music room one wet afternoon, for the first time he could not say how many years, and found it changed and yet not changed. The piano fought under its holland cover, her work-basket on the window seat where she had left it, a book face down upon the arm of a chair, as though she had only just set it aside and meant to return. He picked it up. It was a volume of poems, and the spine was soft with reading, and in the margin beside one verse, in her even hand, she had written a single word, yes, as though agreeing with the poet about some private truth. He read the verse. It was about a woman who waits, and is not come for, and at last ceases to wait. He stood in the cold, quiet room a long while with the book in his hands, and understood that his wife had been speaking to him for years in a language he had never once troubled to learn, and that this margin, this small penciled yes, was perhaps the nearest he had ever come to her thoughts, and that he had had to lose her to find it. The servants felt her going too, in their wordless way. The housekeeper, who had been at Wescliffe 40 years, served him his solitary dinners with a face like a closed door, and he understood that the household had loved its quiet duchess and blamed its careless duke, and were right too. One evening the old woman set down the soup and stood a moment, and said, in a voice that did not quite ask permission, that her grace had always seen to the Christmas baskets for the tenants herself, every year in her own hand, and that someone should be told of it, lest the poor of the parish go without. Aubrey said he would see to it. And then he sat alone over the cooling soup and thought that his wife had been quietly carrying the kindness of his whole estate on her shoulders for 4 years, unthanked, unnoticed, while he learned the drainage of the eastern farms, and he found he could not eat at all. He sat one night with her grandmother's pearls in his hand. She had left them, deliberately, he understood. A duchess's pearls a duchess no longer cared to wear, and he turned his own wedding band on his finger, and could not for the life of him remember the last time he had looked at it. He had a sudden, savage clarity of memory then, her face at the altar lifted to his, full of a hope he had been too busy to see, the young man at the Hartfields making her laugh that laugh, the serene closed smile she had given him down the table. He had married a woman with a whole bright self in her, and he had set her in a corner of his life like a clock he never wound, and one day, quietly, she had simply stopped. He went north in the rain. The journey north was long, and gave a man too much time to think. The roads were bad with the spring rains, and the carriage crawled, and Aubrey sat in the lurching dark with his collar turned up and went, mile by mile, back over 4 years he had never once examined. He had been proud of those years. He had thought himself a model of his order, diligent, sober, unwasteful, a duke who attended to his duty while lesser men gamed and drank and chased actresses. He saw now the rot at the heart of all that diligence. He had attended to his acres and his bureau and his correspondence, because they could be attended to with the surface of a man, the part that signs and surveys and shakes hands, and he had given them everything precisely because his wife asked for the other part, the deep part, the part that must be present and tender and awake, and that part he had let go cold in him for want of use, until he had forgotten he possessed it at all. A man may busy his whole life, he thought, watching the rain run sideways on the glass, and busy at nothing that will matter on the day he dies. He had been busy at nothing, and the one thing that would have mattered had sat at the foot of his table for 4 years, smiling and waiting, and at last had stopped. He stopped one night at a wretched inn and could not sleep, and took out the folded note again and read it by a guttering tallow candle, though he knew it by heart now. She had been for some time a piece of furniture in his house. He turned the words over. He had thought, when first he read them, that they were bitter. He saw now that they were not bitter at all. That was the worst of it. There was no anger in the note, no reproach, nothing he could argue with or be forgiven for. There was only the plain, exhausted statement of a woman who had given up, written in the even hand of someone past weeping, a furious letter he could have answered. This he could only deserve. He folded it away and lay awake till dawn. Linden was a plain stone house on a fell, and her aunt, a sharp, kind old woman who plainly knew everything, let him stand dripping in the hall a good while before she allowed that her niece might, if she chose, receive him. The old woman looked him up and down with eyes that missed nothing, and said, before she let him through, that her niece had come to Linden 4 weeks before with a face like a soul that had been quietly starved, and that she, the aunt, had fed her up on plain food and plain kindness and watched the colour come back into her, and that if the Duke of Wescliffe had crossed 3 counties merely to install that careful, starved look in her niece's face again, he might turn his fine carriage round and starve her himself in comfort at home. Aubrey took the rebuke without a word, for he knew it was just, and the old woman, satisfied perhaps by his silence, sniffed and let him in. Eugenia received him in a small sitting-room with a fire and her sewing in her lap, and she did not rise, and she did not smile the serene closed smile, which he counted, even then, as the first mercy he had been shown. "You found Linden," she said. I had to look at a map. He stood. He had rehearsed a great deal on the long road north and now found he could not say any of it. I did not know where it was. I did not know, Eugenia. I did not know a single thing about you. And I had 4 years to learn, and I learned the drainage of the eastern farms instead. He stopped. I forgot your name, he said, because I had stopped letting Muff see you, because to see you would have been to know what I was doing to you, and a coward looks away. I have been a coward in my own house for 4 years. She was very still over her sewing. I am not asking you to come back to the corner, he said. I am asking, I should like to court my own wife. Badly, no doubt, having never done it. I should like to learn your name as though I had only just heard it. I should like to be the cause of that laugh. His voice was unsteady. He let it be. I have been a careless man and a worse husband, and I have only just discovered that I love you, which is a contemptible time to discover it, and I will spend whatever you will allow me proving I have learned the lesson. For a long moment she only looked at him, the firelight moving on her face, and he saw, God help him, that she was deciding that it could yet go either way, that he had taught her too well to expect nothing of him. Then she set down her sewing. Eugenia, she said softly, is a difficult name to keep forgetting. You may begin, she said, and her mouth curved, not the serene closed smile, but something warmer, something that reached her eyes, by saying it as though it were the only word you knew. He crossed the small room and went down on one knee on the worn carpet of her aunt's sitting room, a duke with the rain still in his hair, and he took her hand, and he said her name. He said it the way the bishop had taught him to say it 4 years before, and he had never once meant. Said it slowly, and then again, learning it, and a third time against her knuckles where his lips rested, and she let out a breath that was half a laugh and half something else, and her free hand came up and rested in his wet hair, and the long, careless silence of 4 years was over. They were a long while at Linden. He learned the fells with her, and the names of her childhood, and the books she loved. He learned that she sang when she thought no one heard, and he took to coming quietly to the door of whatever room to hear it, the way a starving man comes to a warm window. He learned to pour her coffee. He was, his aunt observed acidly when they at last came south, a changed man and not before time, and Eugenia had only smiled, the real smile now, the one he had won back inch by inch, and let it pass. He never forgot her name again. He could not have, he said it too often. He said it at the foot of the table, where she sat once more, in candlelight, no longer furniture but the whole warm centre of the house. He said it last thing at night and first thing at morning, and once, years on, when the same sharp aunt, older, gentler now, asked across another dinner whether he had ever truly learned to use his wife's Christian name, the Duke of Wescliffe lifted his glass to the woman at the foot of his table and said, in a voice that carried clear to every corner of the room, Eugenia. It is the first word I learned worth knowing, and I have not let an hour pass without it since. And Eugenia, who had once smiled and gone, smiled now and stayed, and knew to the marrow of her that she was seen.